when last we left our heroes.
Since episode 1 we have continued our grind on the rank ladder using our Bolus's Citadel combo deck. We've had a mix of fortunes when we had some lucky wins and lost a lot against mono red. At one point we found ourselves in the purgatory of win one, lose one, win one, lose one. That was until we hit a great run on Friday whilst most people in the UK were at FNM. We strung together a series of wins until... Hallelujah, 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 Hallelujah. We made it to Diamond. Now is the chance for us to test a new deck without fear of losing our rank, so let's see how this deck does as we try to make it to Mythic.
Cue the dramatic intro.
We are playing a tribal deck that looks to go wide with Elves. Nissa, who shakes the world, is a planeswalker that doubles the amount of green mana we can create from our forests, so you can also turn your lands into creatures, allowing you to incorporate her into a go-wide beatdown strategy. We start with a ramp package of Llanowar Elves, Incubation Druid, and Nissa's Triumph. These allow us to play big spells ahead of curve or guarantee our land drops to fuel Nissa. Marwyn the Nurturer offers the opportunity of Mega Ramp due to her tribal synergies. Growth Chamber Guardian ensures that we have creatures to play by replacing itself whenever it adapts. It also acts as a decent blocker against other creature decks as it often a 4/4 on turn 3. Elvish Clancaller is the lord that pumps the majority of our team and allows Marwyn to tap for extra mana. Steelleaf Champion is the best elf in Standard and should always be played on turn 2 when you have the chance. Evolution Sage allows us to proliferate whenever our land enters play, which goes hand in hand with Nissa's Triumph and Nissa's own ultimate. Biogenic Ooze offers us more creatures with counters to benefit from proliferate, and it is easy to create multiple oozes a turn, especially when Nissa is in play. Blanchwood Armour turns any of our elves into giants due to the number of forests we play. End-Raze Forerunners acts as our big finisher that can give all of our creatures +2/+2 and trample. We play 20 forests due to the number of mana dorks we have, with no utility lands in order to make the most of Nissa's ability. For those that prefer best of 3, our sideboard contains a Boreal Grazer and Crawl Harpooner, as the deck does have a weakness to flyers. Rabid Bite and Root Snare offer removal and damage prevention against aggro decks. Song of Frailes helps us against white weenie decks by growing our board and letting us swing with Indestructible. Thorn Lieutenant comes in against decks with a lot of spot removal. Reclamation Sage is good against control and Wilderness Reclamation decks. And the Awakening of Vitu-Ghazi is a good sideboard to try and put in to catch your opponent off guard. Time for the gameplay. In game 1 we keep a 3-land hand with Clancallers, Steelleaf and Nissa. Whilst not ideal, we can at least cast Steelleaf on turn 3. Our opponent leads with a Llanowar Elf and passes the turn. We draw another 2-drop in Nissa's Triumph, play a land and pass. Our opponent plays a Hinterland Harbour before casting a Wildgrowth Walker and attacking for 1. We draw a Growth Chamber Guardian and cast it turn 2 to give us a semi-decent blocker. Our opponent plays a Swamp and casts Davriel, which he ticks down in order to force us to discard a card. We discard a Clancaller as we have a spare in hand. We attack Davriel with a Growth Chamber, leaving up enough mana to adapt if necessary. Our opponent either has to let Davriel die or block with a creature that dies in combat after we adapt. He blocks with a Wildgrowth Walker, which we are more than happy to see go. On their turn, our opponent ticks down Davriel again, to which we discard a forest. We have 3 lands to cast Steelleaf, and Nissa's Triumph will be able to replace it with other lands. They do nothing else and pass. We draw an Incubation Druid and attack the Davriel with our Growth Chamber. Again, either Davriel dies now or our opponent blocks and loses their Llanowar, with either outcome being favourable to us. They do block and the elf dies. We try to bait out any potential counter spells with Nissa's Triumph. It resolves and we restock our hand with Forest to guarantee our next couple of land drops. We finish the turn with a second Growth Chamber Guardian representing 8 power on board next turn. However, on our opponent's turn they draw their card and concede. It's possible they missed a land drop and felt too far behind, but either way we take the win. Game 2 we mulligan our first hand as there is no ramp and it's 2 top heavy. We keep a ramp heavy 6 with an Incubation Druid on top. Our opponent is on mono red and leads with the Gitu Lava Runner. We play Llanowar Elves and pass. Our game plan pivots at this point as our early drops are prime targets for removal. This is fine as we progress to playing the biogenic ooze we have in hand, as it keeps the burn spells away from our face. Our elf eats a shock and they attack for 1. We cast Incubation Druid on turn 2 to bait out more burn after drawing a land. Lightning Strike takes care of the Incubation Druid whilst pumping the Lava Runner and they attack for 2. We need to guarantee a biogenic ooze on turn 5, so we cast a Llanowar Elf to soak up some damage before casting Nissa's Triumph to find the lands we need. Unfortunately for our little elf, our opponent casts a Chain Whirler to eliminate it from the board, and we take the damage from their attack. The top deck gods smile on us and give us the perfect blocker in a Steel Leaf Champion. Assuming they are not running Lava Coil, it will take at least 2 spells to remove this before it has a chance to block. Our opponent attacks and we assume the line of play will be to deal some damage to the Steel Leaf in order for the Chain Whirler to see it off with first strike damage, or to trade with the Lava Runner. We want to preserve life totals, so we block the Chain Whirler and to our surprise the damage resolves. Expecting a second Chain Whirler, our opponent plays a Steamkin before finishing off our Steel Leaf Champion with a Skewer the Critics. Turn 5 and we cast a Biogenic Ooze to give us 2 bodies on the board that can block well against our opponent's creatures. A Pyromancer from our opponent deals 2 damage to us, allowing them to light up the stage to dig for more cards. They play the land they find and cast a second light up, revealing a mountain and another Lava Runner. Now in combat we choose to double block the Steamkin to make sure it dies as they get out of hand very quickly. After damage we are left with an Ooze token and 8 life. On our turn we draw a Llanowar Elves and cast it alongside the Clan Caller. As the board stands we are able to now at least trade our creatures with theirs as we hope to find our bombs. Nissa's Triumph thins our deck with another 2 lands and we pass the turn. Chandra from our opponent ticks up and reveals a Fanatical Firebrand. They choose to play the Lava Runner from before and swing with everything. We block each creature in such a way that only our Ooze token lives in the hope that we outdraw our opponent. Once again the top deck gods are with us and we draw a Nissa. We tick up to make one of our lands into a 3-3 with Vigilance and Haste and attack for 6. We are ignoring Chandra here as the damage she would send our way would put our life total at 3, meaning we are burn spell from death. Chandra finds a second copy of herself and with 1 card in hand our opponent passes the turn. We draw an Endraze Forerunners which we are easily able to cast thanks to Nissa's static ability. We float the mana first before creating a second land creature. This is so all our creatures benefit from the Forerunners enter the battlefield trigger. It pumps our team and we swing for 21 points of damage and the win. Game 3 was a largely uneventful affair. We played against a Bant deck centred around Aketra and her ability to make a big bad zombie token. Our opponent controlled the early game by having Wildgrowth Walkers and Jadelight Rangers as heavy blockers, whilst using Baby Teferi to keep us off tempo by bouncing our Steel Leaf Champion back to our hand. At one point we looked to be in a strong position when Nissa made a couple of creatures, but a Deputy of Detention soon took care of her. We traded advantages back and forth as we tried to keep his army of Planeswalkers at bay. A second Nissa was exiled using Prison Realm, and once Aketra hit the battlefield it became very difficult to try and manoeuvre about her tokens. A Hydroid Crassus from the opponent allowed them to swing in the air and defend with their ground creatures. We were unfortunate not to draw more lands, preventing us from proliferating and giving us an option to attack sooner. However, with lethal on the board from the opponent, we take a punt and send in the troops, because as the old saying goes, math is for blockers. In all honesty, this was a complete punt to see if our opponent would block incorrectly and we could sneak a victory, but alas, when the dust settled, we were left with a minimal board and no way to deal with the Crassus. Game 4 and we keep a ramp heavy hand which, barring any disruption, allows us to play a Biogenic Ooze on turn 3. We cast a Llanowar and pass. Our opponent casts Legion Landing, suggesting he is on White Weenie. He makes the 1-1 and passes. Turn 2 and feeling under no pressure we cast Incubation Druid into Llanowar Elves so our Ooze can enter the fray next turn. Snubhorn Sentry from our opponent and they pass the turn. We drop the big Ooze who brings a friend and a third Llanowar Elf before the Oozes get bigger on end step. History of Benalia from our opponent gives them a 2-2 Knight token and they pass as they have no favourable attacks. On our next turn we draw land number 4. This allows us to cast Evolution Sage before playing our land, triggering her Proliferate ability. As we resolve the ability to add counters to our oozes, our opponent concedes and we pick up the win. Game 5 and we mulligan a 7 that has no plays until turn 3, into a 6 that isn't much better. However, our land on top ensures that we can cast Steel Leaf Champion on turn 3. We play a forest and pass, and our opponent plays a Lanoir for their turn. We draw the forest we scryed earlier and cast a Clan Caller to give us a presence on the board. Our opponent plays a mountain followed by a Pelt Collector. A shock takes care of our Clan Caller and they attack for 1. We draw a Nissa and decide to cast Marwyn, as providing she lives, she'll allow us to cast both the Steel Leaf Champion and the Clan Caller next turn. Our opponent casts a Nullhide Ferox, adding a counter to his Pelt Collector, and he attacks for 2. The following turn we draw a forest and cast Steel Leaf Champion. This adds a counter to Marwyn, and she now allows us to cast the Clan Caller, adding an additional counter. This also makes our Steel Leaf Champion 6/5, which will at least trade with the Ferox. Knowing we have Nissa and the ability to cast her next turn, this is a trade we will be happy to make. As we assumed, our opponent attacks with the Ferox and we block with the Steel Leaf Champion and they both die. The Pelt Collector gets a 3rd counter and our opponent then casts Mini Vivian, opting to tick up and give the Pelt Collector Vigilance and Reach. We draw an Incubation Druid and use the mana from Marwyn to cast Nissa. We follow up with the Incubation Druid, who is now a 1/3 thanks to the Clan Caller, before turning one of our forests into a 3/3 with Vigilance and Haste. At this point we attack the Vivian, assuming our opponent will block with the Pelt Collector to take us down a land. Before damage we use the land to adapt our Incubation Druid, turning her into a 4/6 that can also tap for 3 mana. On their turn, our opponent ticks down Vivian to exile a card, plays a mountain and passes. As all their creatures currently have flash, we are expecting at least one to appear as a surprise blocker. Back to us and we cast Nissa's Triumph, which now finds us 3 forests, allowing us to replace any we lose in combat. We uptick Nissa, creating another 3/3 and attack. We send 2 creatures towards Vivian and Marwyn towards our opponent, as we are expecting a flash blocker and want to make sure Vivian dies. Before blocks, our opponent casts a Jadelight Ranger, who explodes into a land and a Domri. They then cast a Gruul Spellbreaker, giving it a +1/+1 counter thanks to its Riot ability. They block the forest with the Spellbreaker, and in response we search up another Clan Caller to increase the damage we are dealing. In hindsight, we were a little lucky they didn't chunk with the Jadelight Ranger, as this would have let Vivian live. Our opponent cast Domri, leaving them with no cards in hand. They tick down to have the Spellbreaker fight our only blocker. This gives them a free swing at Nissa, who dies. On our turn, our opponent has only their Jadelight Ranger to block, so we attack with our 2 big creatures who would survive any blocks that the opponent makes. Our opponent takes the 10 damage and goes to 3. We follow up with an Incubation Druid and we are now both top decking. On our opponent's turn, they uptick Domri to add red mana and do nothing, leaving their creatures back to block. On our turn, we draw a second Marwyn. We play the land in our hand that our opponent knew about, giving us 5. This allows us to adapt the Incubation Druid at instant speed without the need for Marwyn. We attack with 3 creatures, as once again we will be able to survive all their blocks and our opponent needs to block everything in order to survive. For some reason, they double block Marwyn and throw the Lanoir in front of the bigger Incubation Druid on board. Before the damage, we adapt our second Incubation Druid and deal lethal for the win. We ended the session 2 steps from Diamond 3 with a 4-1 record. Overall, the deck is extremely fun to play and can have some explosive turns. Its main weakness is flyers, and there is a need to not overextend into any potential board wipes. A copy of the deck list is in the description below should you wish to have a go yourself. Thanks for watching, and before you go, if you like the video, please do like, share and subscribe. If you have a suggestion for the deck or the sideboard, or if you want to talk about the video in any way, please leave a comment. And don't forget, you can follow us on all the socials at Making Mythic. See you next time.